Welcome to the show today. My name is Douglas Gabriel. Today, I'm going to be interviewing one of my dearest friends, John Barnwell, about an article that he recently wrote, which is something that I really like to do also, to go and look at everything Rudolf Steiner said about a topic. And John has put together a wonderful 73-page book, which I'm suggesting he make into an ebook, that is everything Steiner said about the Muslims, the Islamic faith, and Muhammad. And I was reviewing it yesterday, and I thought, oh my goodness, I would like for him to talk about this. And so it led into a conversation earlier today where basically it's the question that I'm dealing with as I'm writing the third chapter of a novel called Immortal Love. And below this video, you will find the connections to the first two chapters of that book. Of course, I keep changing the name of the book. Don't know what it'll be in the end. I usually let Tyler decide that. But right now, its working title is Immortal Love because it's about a couple and their reincarnations together. It's a pseudo-fictional, pseudo-historical story, and it talks about the sequoias and it talks about ancient China. And now I'm working on one about the Emperor Justinian II and his wife Theodora, two of the most significant people, certainly in Roman history, basically in Western history, and essentially, one would say, most historians will agree, as a matter of fact, that Justinian II was the greatest administrator ever to hold a kingdom together because he was the Byzantine emperor of the eastern side of the Roman Empire in the late 500 AD, going into 600, and he married Theodora, one of these women who they would basically say horrible things about them because they would say they're concubines and they're prostitutes. But who were these women like Diotima, the teacher of Socrates, or Asparia, the teacher of Pericles, or these incredible women? And in this case, it's Theodora. So John, the other day, as we were speaking, said somehow he drew attention to in terms of the Muslims, that some of their writings are connected to original Aramaic and Syriac from Syria writings, and that they could be found. And then I remembered they could be found in the monastery of St. Catherine in Saudi Arabia at the foot of Mount Sinai, where literally they say Moses saw the burning bush. And later, Justinian II built a library there that was equal to Alexandria, equal to Antioch, equal to the library in the Byzantine library in Constantinople, where that's where his throne was. And essentially, Theodora had studied at all these places. And so one could say, well, this is the question for John today. Why would Justinian II in 529, between 527 and 529, close down the Athenian schools, the school of that had been going on for hundreds of years, these academies? Why would the academies be closed by Justinian? I mean, we know the outer answer to that. He wanted to make everybody one religion because it was easier to administrate, though he didn't persecute those who were not of his particular ilk of Orthodox Christianity. And so he closed the academy, and they went to a place outside of Baghdad, to a place sometimes called Jundi Shapur. And there was a counselor there that John, I want to explain in prepping to tell us about the foundation that is needed to understand the document that he's produced, which I don't remember if he put a name on it, a title for it, but basically it's Steiner's indications on Jundi Shapur and the materialistic effects of the science that was transferred from the Greeks to, you'd call, the Persians, or basically, as I say, outside of Baghdad. This is a mixture of ancient Persia, modern Persia, Assyrian, Babylonian, Arab, and later Muslim, Islamic, and then this Islamic influence. This is the big question. As the school of Athens were closed, the Academy of Athens was closed and it moved to Persia. What effect did that have upon the world? I believe that as I'm writing the third chapter to this book called Eternal Love, that I've been held up for months trying to figure out the second part of the third chapter because it's so complicated. I had to go back and study so much history, it's ridiculous. And John gave me some wonderful clues the other day, which led to the fact that it's obvious that I'm stupid and I didn't see from the beginning that St. Catherine's Library and Monastery, as it's called today, at the foot of Mount Sinai, was created by Theodora to preserve the persecution of the Alexandria Library, where she was, the Antioch, the Ephesus, and the Constantinople Library, which she was trying to reform to be much more tolerant to all religions, pagan, heretics, Jews, everyone. And so she is just an amazing figure out of history. And I was able to write about her up till the time that she marries Justinian. But then I was stuck. So I have to thank John for this. But also, I'm going to make a list of questions for you here, John. There's only going to be three main questions. Why do anthroposophists freak out when you mention Muslims, Islam, Mohammed, and they won't go anywhere near it? There's no books on it that are good that you could say are a definitive statement of Rudolf Steiner's indications about the Muslim religion. And I have a lot to say about that. But in the last year or two, you have brought forth evidence that you've shown myself and other conclave members that demonstrate that Mecca is questioned in history, that the original Quran, its origins are now questioned. And I was pointing out to you earlier today, well, Abraham, they question whether Abraham was a historical figure, whether Moses was, whether Jesus was, whether Muhammad was. And so we are in an age where everything could just be uh, basically negated. It can be canceled because people say, you don't have enough historical evidence, none of that exists. And then they try to belittle the influence of Islam, the influence of Christianity, the influence of Judaism. And so I want to welcome you to the show today and ask you if you can address, your recent article, which we will attach to this video, and that you might try to answer those two or three basic questions, which I had to frame with such a long introduction. So, John, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, when you start to approach these topics, what I try to do is develop what I call a meta narrative, and that gives me like a really broad picture. I approach it more like a painter, and he's going to paint part of a tree over here. Although when he starts painting, you don't realize it's a tree if you're not the artist. And you walk in and you go, well, what's that green blotch over there? And so that you can allow the in streaming content to be able to be free to interact in a way that's not biased by your own previous ways of looking at things. See, and so I try to set aside that aspect of personality that wants to try and confine within the brain your thoughts. I try to open it out into more of a heart space that gives me a sensitivity within the realm of feeling. And that's why, like in my first book, The Arcana of the Grail Angel, I tell people frequently, well, I look at it like it's a phone book because I'm referencing all these individuals throughout history and providing them with a context in time. And once you understand and start to unlock the mysteries of time, it gives you a completely different vantage point to approach a subject. And so it goes back to what Rudolf Steiner said when he'd indicated, and I'm just paraphrasing, but he said that to develop oneself towards an understanding of the spiritual world, that three really wholesome and healthy ways to approach it is through art, music, or history. And so when you start to look at that and it expands your thinking just to be able to have a context in which to think of those three things as having a certain commonality. And so once you get that and you understand that there's something that lives in the life of feeling that's very important. And so you'll sit and think about something, but when it gets down to it, you really pick your choice out of what you deliberated on from your heart. It's really that you think in the coolness of the head, but it's then the warmth of the heart that finds the answer to whatever it is you're approaching. See, so that we can warm our thinking with the process that we're working with, rather than letting it fall, and then it becomes a question of, are you cold about it, or are you hot and wrathful? And so the current tendency in modern culture is they want to push you into that duality of coldness and disinterest and fiery wrath and control. And the challenge is to be able to not be controlled by the narrative, but to allow your painting to unfold. And if you do that, and you do it with a great deal of shall we say, conscience and humility, amazing things can come to the surface that you even didn't even know that that was something that could be looked for. See, so it has to do with a way of doing things, even more than the thing itself.
Absolutely. That was being emphasized in our conversation today, that it's not the Cain and Abel that's the story. It's the spectrum between the two and finding the middle, finding the Christ center. It's not Lucifer and Ahriman, it's the Christ in the middle. It's not basically the whole thing with Steiner indications of the what do they call it, the not the culmination, I think, yeah, the culmination, that the Aristotelians and the Platonists would incarnate now both at the same time. One wants to be too scientific and the other one wants to be too artistic. But that is where Hegel gets a bad rap, as we were saying earlier today. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But until you've truly lived into the thesis and the antithesis, you don't know the spectrum between them, so you can't find the synthesis. So it isn't some kind of formulaic way to control people by creating a problem and then solving it because you had the solution from the beginning. That's not the issue. It's to live into both ends of the spectrum. And so when people, like, for instance, you read these Steiner indications on the Muslims, and you'll think, oh, well, really, they were there at the moment of the birth of um, well, not at the birth, but a very serious moment in history, a watershed moment of materialism entering into science. Well, what about the Greeks? Weren't they materialistic with the way that they interpreted Aristotle? Well, Aristotle's 10 categories, some would say, are the ladder of the hierarchy. It's the description of the Christian hierarchy, or it's the tree of life, it's the Sephiroth, it's the Jacob's ladder into heaven. So when you start to go from the natural clairvoyance of ancient times, when they had answers to all kinds of things through their inherent wisdom through natural clairvoyance. And now you're going to an absolute clear, awake, intellectual clairvoyance. Unfortunately, what you just described is exactly what happens. People just become cold to both ends of the spectrum and ignore it. So they don't do study of history. They don't do comparative studies of history. They don't try to live into what it is that basically we're talking about here, to live into the experience of the duality so that you can come to a resolution with that duality. And essentially, that's the question of all philosophy. It goes back to the ancient Vedic Upanishads.
Yes, I mean, you can find stimulus for deepening your questions, which is all I really tried to do, and I make that clear in my first book, is that I'm trying to improve my questions. And I find that what Rudolf Steiner said was true. He said, you, and I'm paraphrasing again, but he says, you could be creative and uh, perhaps write something early in life, and then many years later, look back on what you've written, and there's so much more in there that you didn't even know at the time. That there's something deeper in you that's providing you with a depth that is not apparent to the evanescent personality, as we should call it. That thing that you normally think of as you. There's a deeper you that's in the picture that can encode in your personality's observation things that will be of value in the future. And so that there's this whole mystery of time, and it's fascinating because one can look at one's own biography and see how there were stages in your development that brought you to certain critical understandings that then gained depth 7 years later and on from there until you're a wizened old fool like myself or Sir Douglas here. You've been through the mill and you've crossed the barrier and you've entered into the realm of the stars, so to speak. You've gotten past the planetary cycles of development, and now you're looking back in retrospect. And the challenge with people, though, is that they get stuck on the retrospect and they don't realize that what we're investing in is the future, and that's the omega. Like before in our most recent talk with each other, we talked about the alpha and the omega. Are we going to look back to Eden and try to recapture Eden? Or are we looking towards that omega to where we are carried forward into a higher destiny? And it's interesting that you mentioned the Justinian and his consort Theodora, because if you go back to Dionysius the Areopagite, who was the head of the school of esoteric Christianity, which was founded by St. Paul in Athens, that there was a woman there mentioned with Dionysius. Hardly anybody ever talks about her, and most historians of that period consider to have been an educated concubine of sorts. That they were the women that were especially gifted with properties of education that are not normally the province of women at that time. And so you have examples of things like Hypatia, for example, the daughter of Sion, who she used to teach mathematics, which is highly unusual, but yet they're out there, and some of the most significant figures in history you find occupying those types of roles. And so you have this Demaris who's representing that Sophia principle, that wisdom principle. And this is really what we're getting at, because if you look at the world from the view of spiritual science, you'd say that there's the Mars half of Earth's evolution, and then at the turning point of time with the incarnation of Christ, we enter into the Mercury half. And you can say, well, okay, well, that's well and good. What does that mean? But it's a challenge in that leading up to the birth and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, the Logos, and his ascension and resurrection, that whole process is encoded the challenge of human evolution. That Rudolf Steiner says that through the incarnation of Christ was able to save the physical and etheric uh, part of mankind. And so that was saved for all mankind, criminals included. But that if we wish to be able to enter into the tutelage of the Holy Spirit, so to speak, that that astral and ego, that the ego that we receive through the agency of Christ, through the sphere of the exousiae, then that's something that's up to us to take up the task and develop it. It's not gifted, so to speak, in the simple sense, although there can be an involvement with grace in which some people seem to receive it, although they haven't apparently done anything in that regard. And that brings in yet the other challenge is reincarnation and karma, because you have people that could be a very significant individual in a particular incarnation, say back in the 9th century, and then reincarnating and ending up that gift didn't translate within the same sphere of activity. And so they have a talent and they end up becoming a composer or a mathematician or any number of vocations. The point is that we mustn't be so confined in our thinking to try and guess that because there's certain cultural similarities that provides us with a continuity. It could be something that's entirely separate from what we might think. And so we have to be open when we look at these things. And this can be a little confusing to people that are new to this type of way of looking at life. But the key is that Rudolf Steiner made the point. It's called anthroposophy, and that's the wisdom of being human. Essentially, is what it means. And so, it behooves oneself to understand. Okay, well, what is a human being? And so, within spiritual science, we say we have a physical body, and then we have the etheric body, the body of memory and the forces of life that we share with the plant kingdom. And then we have a astral body, which is the anima, the animating principle, like we share with the animal kingdom. And then we have the ego above that. And that ego is something that's the youngest member of our being that only came into our realm in this fourth stage of development. What I discussed with the spokesman for the Hopi elders as that planet Earth is the fourth world, that it was preceded by three previous planetary conditions. And so you have to have that kind of a context. But there are people that would say that, why does it have to be so complicated? And Rudolf Steiner says, well, that this is the Christ language, that we, in order to be able to receive certain gifts from Christ, we have to have a means to be able to grasp that idea, and that includes the fourfold nature of the human being. And I don't really know anybody that knows more about that than Douglas here.
Well, actually, you insinuated that I was wise or you were wise. I'd rather see us more like those those old men, those guys sitting in the box seats, always making jokes. They're Statler and Waldorf. I look just like Waldorf. You look just like Statler. So that's the way I see this. We're just sitting back, taking a look at the general and making particular remarks about them. And this type of commentary can expand your capacity to understand time, get you out of the space of materialism and get you into the time of consciousness. And that's what John is referring to. So let's look at this issue that I'm struggling with here is Justinian. He basically then, by closing down the schools of the academy in Athens, gave birth accidentally or wittingly or unwittingly to scientific materialism, which in today's age, if you don't put down that you're a certain religion, then you're given a religion. It's called secular humanism. It's called scientism. In other words, you believe what science tells you. And that then saves you the trouble of having to come up with the thought yourself, which is the problem of today's age. If you get into that cold space instead of the warm middle space, but you get into the cold, dispassionate state where you don't want to be too warm for the either side of the spectrum, the luciferic or the harmonic side of the spectrum, then what happens to you? You basically become a person who isn't evolving. Well, you might say, well, this is a terrible evil. Why did God let materialism convince so many people to believe that the outside world is all there is, and that there's after that there's the cold, dark grave. That's it. Well, that type of materialism had to be there so that we could basically start to ask questions about birth and death, the mysteries we're supposed to be working on. And as we do, Christianity is just about one of the few ways that you can possibly ever comprehend birth and death, because Christ is now the Lord of karma. But he's also the being who descended in the past from the Trinity down through the ranks into the realm of the human, the only truly divine being who's ever done that, as an example. And then, as John pointed out, through that, the physical and the etheric were redeemed, Right now, Christ is active in the etheric realm. The second coming of Christ is happening right now. The apocalypse is happening right now. But as we go into the future, and by the way, one of the gifts of that is memory. Who are you but the memory of what you did from incarnation to incarnation? Who keeps track of that memory? The Lord of Karma. And so memory is another gift, one of the many gifts of Christ, standing upright, speaking, thinking, but also now memory. And in the future, as John pointed out, when the astral and the ego, or the I am, is actually turned into a Christianized version of that, then we develop the capacity for conscience and moral love. And as we follow that path of Christ through these different, basically, incarnations of the earth, we go into the future. So, why do we have materialism now? Because right now we also have, through the gift of the mystery of Golgotha, the capacity to struggle with evil. It's not that our job is to conquer it right now. That was the mistake of Mani, who created Manichaeism, was he tried to struggle with evil a little bit ahead of time. So, do we conquer evil at this point? No, evil is there to wake us up. Look how many people are asleep and give up their ego to materialism, to mammon, to the worship of money, the worship of the material world, and give up their aspirations for the divine to a hollowness of nihilistic materialism, which is basically superstitious science. Science doesn't know much of anything, really. They have some facts, and those facts are determined by what John indicated before, the physical limitations of number, weight, and measure. And so to try to jump always to, well, can I put a number on it? Can I put my name on it because I discovered it? The Gabriel effect. I like it. Can I weigh it? Can I measure it? Can I use my one-eyed color blindness of science on the dead laboratory table, which is supposed to be an altar to the spirit, but it is in fact an altar to materialism? This kind of numbing down of the consciousness of evolving spiritual humanity is the intent of the dark forces. And so, yes, we're in a dark, dark age. It has been darker before, and it may be darker even further into the future, of course. But the deal is, this is the moment when we do exactly what John said. Are we going to go back into Alpha and talk about Eden and go through that same question again? Are you going to reach for the fruit of the tree of knowledge, or are you not? Are you going to wake up? Are you going to know the difference between truth and falsehood, between error and lies and the lies of the serpent? Or are you going to evolve beyond Cain and Abel? Are you going to evolve beyond these things that humanity has as their spiritual history that is shown to us by all of not so much religious doctrine and dogma as religious experience that goes back to the beginning of human history? So when we're struggling with this issue of materialism right now, it's good to be a Theodora. Go create a library that I didn't even know this library existed until John reminded me of it, and I went and looked it up. 3,300 volumes of the most sacred ancient texts there are. And yet no one, it's a continuous library, been working since 532 AD. It's the Library of Alexandria on a smaller scale for religion. And you can be a Theodora. It only took one person. And even of my studies of her, I didn't understand that she probably was the person who created that. Justinian wouldn't have done that. He wasn't being tolerant. He wanted to have one Orthodox Christian faith, period. And anyone who said anything otherwise was a heretic. But Theodora accepted everyone into this universal school of understanding what people are working through. Because, as my wife was just saying, we need to do a substack on this, that chronocentricity. On the earth, there are people going through all stages of spiritual, historical, human development simultaneously. And so, isn't it amazing that you could go to this library and literally look at the oldest books there are, which are some of the books that were used to create the Quran? And so, this insight that John has brought us through Rudolf Steiner's work on Islam and Muhammad is absolutely wonderful. We've been doing some of that with Michael McKibben, but people don't really want to know the truth because they are so happy to believe that they are insulated in their world where everything is in a nice little box the way they were taught, and that's the way it is. But unfortunately, you pull the box out and you look in there and you'll be shocked what you find because it so often is the opposite of exactly what you thought it was. And that's what some of the research John has done lately on Islam and brought it to the attention of myself and others, where you say, wow, holy cow, I'm an old man. I don't know that I can change my mind up that quick and say, no, everything I knew about that particular topic is what? It may not be true. There's another whole version of that that I never knew about. The older I get, the more I find that is true, and that's what some of this research has brought to mind for me.
Uh, yes, you can start looking under the hood and realize that more often than not, you've been given a narrative or even a meta narrative, and been provided with a picture of history, but that's a picture of history that's written by the conquerors. And so it's a form of indoctrination or propaganda, and has an intention to be able to bring you down whatever structured existence that that particular imperium wishes to pursue. And so that once you realize that that is not, like, people are waking up today and realizing that a lot of what they've been told isn't really the case. Well, that's not a new concept. That's just it's new. Is the only newness is that it's new to them because it's been going on. You can go all the way back to the temple paintings of figures like Ramses the Third, with smiting the people to the sea, and he's like, 120 feet tall, and they're 15 feet high, and so that they want you to realize that he's the big guy, and he's dealing with these pesky problem uh, people down there in the bottom, and so it's at the temple of Medinet Habu, with the peoples of the sea. But you have that period that's been predicted around that time, what, 1177 BC, where there was a certain kind of chaos that went on in the Mediterranean, and you have historians writing about trying to come up with the symptomology of history, like why did this happen all of a sudden, and what's the to me what's the most obvious thing that happened at that time is that it's at that time. It's a time changes, and we go through these changes, and the great climacteric, shall we call them, changes, like the sinking of Atlantis, for example. And so that you have a critical time in history at which certain events that are intensifications of your cultural milieu that cause something new to come about. You have this. You can go back and study history, and you look at, like, the 100 Years' War and 30 Years' War. And think about, okay, you've been at war for 100 years. I mean, how does one even do that? And yet that's something that happened. And so you look and you see that people on a certain level really aren't that smart, and they keep making the same mistakes over and over again, thinking that you can support cultural development just through the implements of warfare with a blunt instrument, so to speak, is going to be able to bring you the highest level of culture is not really the case. And so when you go through the course of history and you start studying these sources, you have to keep in mind, is the writer serving an agenda? And you want to try and look past whatever agenda they might be serving and see if you can get the symptomatic view of history, that you see certain critical events, like, for example, with Justinian closing the academy. And the academy itself actually It had been closed earlier, but then had been reopened as a Neoplatonic academy of a quasi Greek, uh, Greco-Roman, really, because you have Plotinus in the mix, Greco-Roman and mysticism. And so you have this, but it has a healthy underpinning because if you look at Plotinus, he was capable of resolving things into a Trinitarian view. And you need the Trinitarian view to have a deeper look at these things because we're human beings. And so we're a fourfold being. So there's the individual facing the three. It's always that's your foundation that you're working with. And with Plotinus, it was the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Which is basically the answer to all questions. If you just look at the good, the true, the beautiful, thinking, feeling, and willing, body, soul, spirit, uh, you know, it's so clear. And of course, now Rudolf Steiner had told us, like you mentioned, Plotinus basically was then adopting some of the mysticism, some of the Gnosticism, some of the teachings of the ancient past. And that's what Justinian didn't like. He wanted to say no more paganism. You do this my way. I'm the head of the I am the imperial head of the empire, and you will believe the way I tell you to, or else if I wish, I can kill you. And these people at that time in Constantinople, they had these factions, the four factions that were at the Hippodrome, and they would be backing the different colors of these groups. And literally, they fought against each other. There was riots over the fact that the monophysite wanted to say there was only one nature of God through Jesus, and that was completely divine. And the other group, the Chalcedonians, would say, no, there were two natures. There was Jesus, who was a human, and then he became God. And so these people would kill each other over this. Literally, there were riots. Tens of thousands of people died, and their whole culture was based upon what they believed. Now, the problem, Theodora came along and she said people should believe what they want. And because she'd studied in North Africa, she was a concubine of um, a person who was the head of one of the major cities in North Africa, and she had access to these fantastic libraries. So in the end, what did she want? Tolerance. She didn't even go for a syncretic monarchian version. She just said everyone should be allowed to believe what they want. And so now the battle happens between Theodore and Justinian, that she says, I'm going to let the biggest pagan in the entire empire live at the imperial palace and be my guest. She allowed all kinds of things to happen that Justinian would frustrate Justinian, because he wanted it to all be just one way. And that was, of course, then he could control it. So he created a standard for all law, which to this very day, Justinian law is still used in some places, because he codified it all so that everyone in the empire, and he also, of course, went back and conquered the Western Roman Empire, and conquered again parts of Persia and other things. He became restored the entire glory of the Roman Empire. The immortal, the eternal city then became Constantinople. And that wasn't just him, that was his wife, who kept saying, you must have tolerance. There are reasons that these different beliefs are the way that they are. They came when they did. We need to put them in perspective, as you pointed out again. It's about the time perspective. If you go back in time and you're studying the Vedic wisdom, well, you must put it in perspective, or you're not going to understand it. You certainly won't be able to then use that and transfer that knowledge and apply it in modern times. And that's what this is really all about. That's the reason I'm writing this novel, to show that love is immortal. And that's the message of Christ, that you are an immortal being. Well, the debate now is, the materialists would say, as John pointed out earlier when we were chatting, they don't even know if there's a tomorrow. The true materialist is only in the moment. They don't think about the future, and they sure don't think about the past and try to learn from the mistakes of the past so that they don't repeat them. Oh, no, no, no. They'd rather just be completely wild and crazy Luciferic and just make things up as they go along, shoot from their hip, fly by the seat of their pants, and give not a hoot to the future and whether or not there's karma, reincarnation, or that you reap what you sow. None of that. None of that. Materialism doesn't provide for any ability to look towards the past or the future. And the proof of that is the following. If you don't have a religion, you're given one, and it's basically the religion of science. And science tells you there's settled science. There's never been any theory that's been settled for longer than 100 years. So it's not settled. And it can't be an authority. And it doesn't even put the human, let alone the human becoming an angel, at the core of the values of scientific experimentation, scientific study. And this is the point. It isn't the winner and the loser, as John was describing earlier. It isn't about who won the battle and then wrote the story down. It's the continuum between them. It's what's in the middle, because that's the impulse, that's the seed for the future. And so Rudolf Steiner pointed out in the past, yes, consciousness was developed on the battlefield. And that's the reason that most historians would just tell you dates of battles, who fought in the battle, who was the general, what was their, what, they'll tell you the lies, they'll tell you the propaganda of these warlords. But the reality is, it was developing consciousness so that whatever the leading cultural edge was, that was able to, through innovation and technology, and I was just thinking about um, Leonardo da Vinci. People think he's an artist. His greatest inventions were for war. He was a consultant to all of the leaders, and he invented war devices. And so when you're looking at his books and his drawings, a lot of those were for war. And so that, but he was a great artist because he developed 3D perspective and so on and so forth, and could mastered it. But he did all kinds of amazingly crazy things. So that's the problem. Materialism leads to war. It leads to the polar dichotomy that cannot be resolved. And that's what Gnosticism in Alexandria, through Theodora, she understood this. It took the perspective of the Trinity, as John said earlier. It's not a monotheism if it's got a Trinity at the top. And so Abraham's monotheism, the monotheism of the Islam, the supposed monotheism of the Christians, which is not, because then they'll tell you, no, but the one God is three in one in three. Each of the, it's this magic interwoven thing. Well, that came, according to Rudolf Steiner, as the result of the incarnation of Lucifer in China in the 3rd millennium BC. And that remnant of that was basically the paganism, the natural clairvoyance that knew that God was a Trinity and that the solar deity was going to incarnate from that Trinity, and that the Holy Spirit would come afterwards and basically then guide all human beings towards the source that they came from. So this gift of Lucifer was found, according to Rudolf Steiner, in the Gnosticism in Alexandria. Well, it is that understanding of the Trinity that the Gnostics brought with their teachings, which also comes from the primal Trinity of the triple goddess, the goddess of birth, death, and rebirth, everywhere, ubiquitously. One of the first things worshipped, of course, there's the tree, the serpent, but there's also then the birthing of children and the physical body of the woman as a temple, and the worship of birth, death, and rebirth, since the woman can birth many children from one womb. So the point is that this Trinity has to be there. Is the Trinity in our age right now? No. It's the duality of this computer. It's the digital binary system. Zeros and ones, on and off, black and white. And when everything comes down to black and white, then evil sneaks in. So we must get to that middle point, as Goethe would point out. It's color, it happens between light and darkness. It is a reaction. It is an interplay. It is a moving spectrum. And that is what we need for the future. As John was saying, what we need now is to get out of the binary and get into the trinary, or whatever you want to call it, the triple, the Trinity. And once you get there, if you can hold three thoughts at once and those thoughts can be opposed to one another and yet still equally true, then you have basically attained a new stage of human development. And people don't do that because they're, as John pointed out, stuck in the alpha or the omega and not in the present. And yet the materialist is in nothing but the present and doesn't recognize the alpha and the omega. So it's an issue of the spectrum. Where on the spectrum are you going to find yourself, and are you going to come to the center, to equilibrium, and really see that it's temperance that must take place to understand the other person's point of view? And in today's age, there's no tolerance whatsoever for the other person's point of view. The second they speak, if they're not like you, many people just hate them. And that is a natural tendency, believe it or not, because we, are still part animal. In some people, that they haven't tamed the animal nature of the zodiac that's in their head, as it were. But the point is, are we going to get out of this woke culture, cancel culture, this ability to have zero tolerance, and yet give anyone with any depravity of the human I am, make them into a protected class of a minority that rules the majority? You see, because everything's reversed now. Truth is falsehood, falsehood is truth. And they're on that spectrum, but they're like a ping pong ball bouncing back and forth, back and forth. It's like thesis, antithesis, and never coming to a synthesis.
Yes, again, back to Plotinus and the good, the true, and the beautiful. But if you look and who was the teacher of Plotinus? Well, he's referred to as Ammonius Saccas. Ammonius, the and Saccas means that in his early life he carried sacks at the shipping yard, probably, and so of humble origins but brilliance of mind, and a Christian, by the way. And so you see that there's this whole idea of the interaction between the cultures of the ancient world and the tradition into the Abrahamic religions of Christianity and Judaism and Islam and all of that. That's quite fascinating because there's a coupling that happens. And if you look at the development of, well, for example, of Islamic culture, you have to realize that it gained a great amount of its key features from Justinian, and that the template that had been laid down for an empire with this monotheistic control over the narrative, meaning, okay, you could be one of those people, but you can't have a big school here. And so you have that kind of cultural development happening. And then later on, when the Quran itself is put together and compiled as a source by Uthman years after the time 22-year time frame of the life of Muhammad, you see that he does the same kind of thing. Okay, this is what we're doing. And he takes the manuscripts that he didn't use and he burns them, so that he's trying to winnow it down to a systematic worldview that he can use. And again, all religion at that time period was political, as the empire was in charge of the religious doctrine of the empire, and so it was out of that type of a milieu of empire that these things arose. And so you see it spread very effectively because of its absolute focus on centrality of the thought narrative that was prevalent amongst the people, but that they would gradually grow into it. And in fact, many of the words that are used didn't even exist at that time. They're later named the things, and that much of the content that refers to its cultural milieu is 200 to 300 years after the events that are represented occurred. And so you have this idea of, can we look at this and with unvarnished uh, spectacles, so to speak, and be able to say, okay, what do we have here? Let us find truth. And so for myself, I basically, my guideposts are the Lord's Prayer in the first 14 verses of the Gospel of John, and the rest is all tentative narrative that is limited to my capacity to be able to unlock it. But it's interesting because I found a wonderful reference here that I'm going to share. It's just a short quotation of Rudolf Steiner's, and he says, Christianity itself appears in the world as something that can only be understood slowly and by degrees, and for an external, though not for an inner point of view. It is very strange that the deeper sides of Christianity have in reality not been fathomed at all by human beings. Christianity came into the world as an objective fact, and the receptive faculties of men were not strong enough to develop the real essence of it in all directions. The objective consequences, therefore, are that Christianity is everywhere living in the subconsciousness, but that for 3 or 4 centuries it has been completely ruined by man. Human beings ruin Christianity through their intellect.
Beautiful. That underscores the point that even Justinian's Christianity was terribly materialistic. And so, just to say that the uh, schools of Jundi Shapur in outside of Baghdad led to materialism. Well, Justinian was materialistic. He was incredibly materialistic, and his form of Christianity, he didn't actually believe what it was that he made the state religion. He was not a confirmed believer in his own dictums. And so it's a fascinating thing because I do believe that it's very apropos to our age. What are you going to believe? Are you going to believe what you're told? Well, if you are, then you may be led down a primrose path that leads to illness because of being told that science has said that electromagnetic frequencies are just dandy. They don't blister the skin. No, but they cook your internal organs from the inside out. Science will say, "Oh, get this medication, get this pill, get this pharmaceutical, whatever." And if you do, you may be endangering yourself. So, who are you going to believe? Well, the problem is we have to believe ourselves. We have to be the new Academy of Athens, the new Jundi Shapur, the new Alexandria, the new St. Catherine's Monastery Library. We have to do our own research. And it is the research itself. It isn't the end results. It isn't stacking up the 330 books of Rudolf Steiner and saying, I've read them all now. Whew, man, that was tough. It took years, but I've read every single word. That won't help you. It's about living it. It's about turning it into that warmed up thinking that can be found in the heart. It's about turning it from imagination into inspiration and then into intuition. And so the job is that each one of us needs to now be the master and the teacher, the initiator and the chela, the hierophant and the chela, uh, or the aspirant. So what happens is we need to learn a new language, and not the language of materialism, not the language of uh, scientism, not even the dead languages of philosophy that people are still trying to, with all their efforts, keep alive and resurrect through existentialism or through phenomenology or through Goethean science. The point is, what is all that about? It's about adjusting your own perspective so that your perception can see what stands behind the physical world and that your longing for the divine can be fulfilled. That's really it, as John just pointed out. It's really it's as simple as Christ made it. There's only one law, and that need to put it into a stone like Hammurabi did, or the Assyrians before Hammurabi and the Babylonians, or the Egyptians. When the laws were carved in the stone, they weren't allowed to say those things, even if they knew what they meant, internally, quietly. They couldn't have silent reading because inside there, as John pointed out, Lucifer was there and it could confuse them. So, what are we supposed to do now? We have to learn the language of the Spirit. We have to learn the language that's carved in the stone of our heart, the grail stone of our heart. We have to, and what is that? Your own name is inscribed there. And what is your name? Your name is not I, but Christ in me. So, in Christ, when you can raise yourself up into your higher three spiritual natures, you can become Christed. That's all there is to it. And really, the only rule is to love God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your neighbor as yourself. And yes, as John pointed out, the Our Father and the first verses of St. John's Gospel is all you really need. It's a matter of ethical individualism, of basically uh, creating the magic of co-creative interaction with divine will and the mercy and the grace of the divine with your own will and your own selflessness, because you can't have all the grace and the mercy without selflessness. So the efforts of a Justinian and a Theodora, or the efforts of Jundi Shapur, or the efforts of the Muslims to basically encode or still use or infuse or make a syncretic relationship between ancient Persia, ancient Indian wisdom, ancient Mesopotamia wisdom, Christianity, Hebrew wisdom. That is really what our job is. We have to create and what's called the eternal gospel in the Apocalypse of St. John. We have to sing the eternal song. And what is that eternal? It's that you are immortal. It's very simple what Christ taught us. We are immortal. And some things are immortal, like love, grace, mercy, all the great virtues, the pillars of the temple. Uh, and these pillars of the temple, by the way, I was going to mention this in my last talk. If you go to volume 3 of the Gospel Sophia, it'll spell out the different pillars. And these pillars are virtues. And the virtues will counteract vices. You don't even need, if you stop your vices, you'll become more spiritual. But if then you focus on virtues, you can build a spiritual, eternal, ethereal, it's in the ethers that you're building this for the future. You can build a temple that is divine, that is filled with virtue, with wisdom. And then it's a place for, just like the Greeks, they built their temples so the gods would come in and dwell in those temples. And then they built a statue to represent the god indwelling it, 27 feet tall. They thought they were, giant titans. You're a giant titan, especially at night, and especially when you're doing spiritual work. You're pushing into the future, and you can build this temple of wisdom that is described in my wife's beautiful book, The Gospel of Sophia, Volume 3, Sophia Christos Initiation, which I helped on, by the way. And in there, it will show you the language of the Spirit. And it is taken from all world religions. And we show you that in every world religion, there's usually 22 sayings, 22 moral axioms that lead to a language of the Spirit. And it doesn't matter if it's a traditional religion, if it's really a true one, contacting true spiritual beings, instead of just forces like in our religion of science, they contact forces. Ooh, but never a being. There's no being in the universe, just intelligent design. But design, don't let that imply that there's a being behind designing. So what we give you is a language of the Spirit and show you different ways to analyze these things yourself. So you could go to any book practically that is a recognized traditional religion source book, and you will find that it is there and that it's similar, but it comes down to the golden rule. It's just the golden rule. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. And of course, you have to love yourself too. But the point is that what John is talking about is getting out into the perspective, out of the materialistic perspective of space, into the more spiritual rhythms of time. And that is a key factor that someone who is on the path that is following these things, this path of the arcana of the Grail Angel, like John's title is John's book, it is very simple to do, and you do not need a guru, you do not need a master teacher, you do not need a priest or a priestess. All you need is your higher self. viewed through the through the eyes of Christ, not I, but Christ in me. And then Sophia, the being of wisdom, the archangel Michael, the Holy Spirit, all of them will come and they will be happy to help you. And that's the beauty of it. And that's not an old natural clairvoyance. That's the new intellectual clairvoyance that Steiner talks about with spiritual science.
Yes, you have that which is a gift, and then you have what you've done with that gift, and that's your part, and you're unique in and of yourself. You're the only one of you that is truly you, and so it behooves one to see, well, what can that possibly mean? And when you start looking deeper, and Douglas and I have both found the works of Dr. Rudolf Steiner most helpful in that regard. It doesn't hurt that he has over 6,780 some lectures that are available, and over 50 published books and articles and so forth. So you have the most comprehensive corpus of work or body of work of any single individual. And it's all interweaving. And when you see that it's internally consistent, you realize that you're dealing with something that has a strong basis in reality, because it'd be impossible to just make it up. That it's based on what Rudolf Steiner said it was, that he took his powers of perception of the realms of the supersensible and was able to use those as the capacity to be able to perceive things and unlock the secrets of space and time through a level of consciousness that's not the normal state of consciousness in this current period of time that we're dwelling in, but yet it provides us the insights, because in the future we will come to where these things begin to open up. But do we have the content that makes it so that you can have it be a wholesome experience, other than just a chaotic thing that you don't understand? I mean, what if all of a sudden tomorrow you woke up and you were clairvoyant? Would you really be able to figure out what it was you were looking at and why it was behaving in the way it was, and what was your role within that? So the idea is to be able to come to these things in a wholesome way. And so, in pursuit of the good, the true, and the beautiful, then it's important to have the humility to be able to approach it with wonder, awe, and reverence.